Welcome to the session on the use of big data in criminal justice system. I'd like to start with some introductory remarks, then introduce the panelists, and then we'll entertain questions that people will, as they did in the earlier session, people will be circulating, and you can write your questions if you have any, and I will pose them to the panelists. So let me say a word before I introduce the panelists. Let me say a word about the genesis of this panel, that we can really take a page from Graham's book, in the sense that one hopeful message in Graham's talk was the idea that there are other sources of data, some of them private, some of them public, that we can bring to bear on the problems that we are currently using a certain set of methods to address. And so I think that was the genesis of this panel. And when I heard Graham say that, I said to myself, this sounds more like a hope than a plan in some ways. And so I think because it's not that easy to sort of take all this massive amount of data, which is exploding, most of it operational data, data on the internet from various sources. And I think to take this data and turn it into something that's useful statistically. And I think the panelists today are taking those initial steps where people begin to take a look at using these types of data that are all around us, and then subjecting those data to some sort of quality assessment. Because if you listen to Angela in the initial session, that quality is the thing that presumably sets statistics apart from other forms of information. So federal and national statistics presume a certain quality, and so the big data that's around us everywhere, and that we're beginning to think about, we've not yet subjected those data to any kind of rigorous assessment of quality. And indeed, we don't really have the same frameworks like total survey error and things like that have been available in the formal statistical community for quite some time. So I look at this panel as sort of moving beyond the hope and beginning to look at how people actually bring these data to bear on criminal justice issues. And to a certain extent, that's the beginning of the assessment of quality that we must do before we can fully embrace the kind of thing that Graham talked about. So that was the genesis of this panel. And we had 3 panelists. Bill Sable, the former director of the Bureau of Justice Statistics in the United States, was scheduled to be here and present, but Bill resigned, and he felt a little funny talking about work that was being done by the Bureau of Justice Statistics without himself being part of that. So for that reason, Bill has sort of declined, and Chris Cutler from Apt Associates has been good enough to step in for Bill. He's very familiar with the work that Bill was going to talk about, and we'll be talking about that today. They're really considering the purpose in assessing fitness of use of administrative data. So Chris is going to look at a variety of ways in which the folks in the United States have begun to look at the very important indicator of recidivism, and there are new administrative data from the state correctional systems available, as well as the criminal history data that has been available for a long time. And he's looking at those various sources of administrative record data and seeing what kind of error structure they have in that sense, and what kind of things they're good for. I think the second presentation will be by Duran Banks, and Duran is estimating arrest-related deaths in the United States, and she's comparing the utility of an open data source approach to a voluntary agency methodology that's much more customary both in the United States, here in Mexico, and almost everywhere where statistical agencies are involved. And last but certainly not least is Gary Lafree from the University of Maryland, who is the director of the START Center at Maryland, which is one of the several centers around the country that essentially amasses and analyzes data on terrorism. And what Gary will describe is about a decade-long work using big data to build open source terrorism databases. And so Gary's built that. He's gone through many iterations and also struggled with the issue of quality. So those are the three presenters. We're going to start with Chris, if you will.
Morning. My name is Chris Cutler, and I work at Apt Associates. My presentation today is on the National Corrections Reporting Program, which is a U.S.-wide data collection from state DOCs. I will be talking about the data set itself, some of the exciting innovations that we've looked into with recidivism, and where we plan to go next. Next slide. How do we change slides?
We're having some trouble changing the slides. Does anybody?
All right, well, I'll start.
Chris, I think it's working now.
Okay, thank you. The National Corrections Reporting Program was started by the Bureau of Justice Statistics in 1983. Over the past 20 plus years, 30 plus years, it's undergone a number of changes. The collection itself is an annual collection from all U.S. states in which BJS requests data on prison and post-confinement supervision records. We collect prison admissions, prison releases, year-end stocks, as well as recently we've started collecting post-confinement community supervision admissions and releases. While the collection's been going on since 1983, Apt Associates has been the data collection agent since 2010. Next slide. So the NCRP is a very broad data source, which is compiled with information presented from all 50 U.S. states and the District of Columbia. We get a bunch of information about the offenders. We collect DOC numbers, state inmate IDs. Recently, we've begun collecting FBI and Social Security numbers in the hopes that this will allow data analysts to link individuals across states. We collect a number of offender characteristics, including name, date of birth, race, ethnicity, gender, education, veteran status, and for this upcoming year, we started collecting the last known address for prison admissions. We collect information on sentencing, including county where someone was sentenced. We keep the 3 most serious offenses, as well as the sentence associated with those offenses. We record the admission date and type, as well as the release date and type. As you can imagine, the quality of this data varies tremendously from one state to another. Some states provide very complete records with data that is believable. Other states are only able to provide certain variables, and the records that are provided are a little more suspect. Next slide, please. The presentation today is going to focus on our 3 prison-related files. I will refer to them as the Part A, B, and D records. The A records refer to our prison admissions, where we collect 1 record for each admission of a sentenced offender. Our B records are the release records from prison, and the D records are the annual year-end custody stock. Now, as you can imagine, this is a bunch of information, and without any effort to handle it, you can anticipate there being a lot of ambiguity as far as seeing people who have multiple admission records before you have a release. And so over the past 5 years, Apt, in association with BJS, has worked together to develop an algorithm in which we combine these different records into what we refer to as terms. Next slide, please. The basic principle of our algorithm is to take the A records and find a matching B record. Fortunately, for most of our states and most of our records, there is a matching A to a B. We then cross-validate these terms with the stock records to ensure that people we say are in prison at the end of a year truly are. As you can imagine, there are a number of ambiguities that arise from this process of combining admission and releases. Some of the more common ones are we will see multiple admission records, that occur before a release, or we will see an admission record that's followed by a release that has a different admission date. And so we apply an algorithm that is designed to handle these ambiguities and make very clear to the data users what those ambiguities were. In this slide here, I want to just demonstrate some of the benefits of creating a unified term file. The first line is a person with a single term. The first bracket is their admission, and the second bracket is their matching release. You can see that over time, if we are able to link records together, you can get a complete history of a person's flow in and out of a state prison. So the second person has 2 distinct prison terms that we were able to link using some of the identifiers that I mentioned earlier. To give you a scope of the NCRP term file, we have data ranging from 1971 to the most recently archived year of 2014. This represents nearly 11 million prison terms for over 6.1 million different offenders. As I mentioned before, the years of data vary tremendously by state. Some states we have data back to 71 or 1989. Other states we only have a couple years of terms. In total, we build terms for 43 states in the District of Columbia. There are 7 states that the quality of the data is too suspect at the moment for us to feel comfortable building terms and making those publicly available. We have 16 states that have continuous data from 2000 to 2014, which is fantastic because it allows us to do different analyses using multiple states for a very long time period. The data that we put in the term file is data that we believe to be fairly complete and fairly believable. And so the rest of my presentation today is going to be on using that cohort of the states that we have for 2000 to 2014 to estimate recidivism in a pseudo-national group. Now, these are not meant to be conclusive evidence. They're just meant to be demonstrations of how you can use the NCRP data system to compare recidivism across states or over time. When I say recidivism, what I'm referring to is a return to prison in the same state. So it's not a rearrest, it's only a reincarceration. We limit it to the same state because currently we don't have a reliable method to link records across states, although as I'll get into later, we are working on a method to link individuals who enter prison in multiple states. We exclude individuals who are released for a death, transfers, and absconders, and we do not include returns of less than 30 days or offenders who are under 18 or over 65 at the time of admission. Most of the graphics that I'm going to show today relate to traditional recidivism methods, what we refer to at APT as event-based recidivism, which is based upon the release cohort method of recidivism. Over the past few years, several of my colleagues have developed a secondary methodology, which we refer internally as offender-based recidivism. And this is based on the principle that of those individuals who are released from prison, not all recidivate at a similar rate. Some will leave and never return. Others will leave and return once, while there's a small subset of offenders who will return to prison numerous times. By using the traditional release cohort method, the individuals who are cycling continuously in and out of prison are oversampled as compared to those who return once or never return. So our offender-based methodology takes into consideration a person's entire criminal history. Sampling from that, we get a reduced estimate of recidivism where each person is represented equally. One question that users and policymakers might have is how soon do how soon do offenders who are released from prison return? This graphic up on the screen shows the distribution of 1 to 14-year rates of the 16 states that had continuous data from 2000 to 2014. This is the 2000 release cohort. And at each time point, you'll notice that there's the error bars, 2 different shaded blocks, and then a red line. The red line represents the median recidivism rate of our 16 states. The bottom line represents the minimum estimate. The highest line represents the highest recidivism estimate. And the 2 shaded blocks indicate the interquartile range. This is by state. So you'll see that in a sample of only 16 states, the estimates vary tremendously from one state to the next. So at a 1-year recidivism rate, some states have as few as 6% of released offenders returning to prison, whereas at least one other state had more than 50% of their released offenders returning to prison. The purpose of this graph is to demonstrate that using a data set like the NCRP is very important to note which states and which elements you're including in your analysis. Your estimates will vary tremendously depending upon the composition of your estimates as well as how the states are represented. In this graphic, each state is given equal weight. So a state with a population such as Delaware, the second or third smallest state in the US, has the same weight as California, which has the largest penal system in the US. So depending upon how you choose to weight your estimate, your picture will look very different. Some other questions that people might have when looking at the data and determining recidivism is how does recidivism vary by different offender characteristics? So you could think of offense type. This graph is used to demonstrate that property offenders are more likely to return to prison than any other type of offender for the offenders released in the 16-state sample that I mentioned previously. The drug and other offenders are very similar. They follow almost the same trajectory, which is why you can't really make out much of a distinction between the purple and blue lines. And violent offenders, on the whole, recidivate at slightly lower rates. Age at admission is another offender characteristic that could be of interest to policymakers when looking at recidivism statistics. As you might expect, younger offenders tend to recidivate at much higher rates than those who are older. This next graphic is designed to address the question of how have recidivism rates changed over time. You can imagine doing this at a state-by-state level and taking the states that have a longer time horizon and seeing if the trends have changed. This picture is designed to give a preliminary look into what a national estimate of recidivism might look like. As you can see, the recidivism rates increased slightly around the middle of the 2000s and has decreased slightly ever since. This, again, is only based upon the individuals in the 16 states that were included in the sample, but you could imagine doing a similar analysis for a shorter number of years by including only certain states. All of these graphics underline the same point that when you are talking about big data and a data set that is as varied as the NCRP, where different states provide different years of data, you can get many different pictures and look at many different analyses depending on what's most important. If you are interested in a longer time horizon, then by default you are forced to use a smaller number of states in order to be consistent across the series. On the other hand, if you're interested in getting a broader estimate and including as many states as you can, that's certainly possible, but you want to restrict your analysis to only those years in which data exists for multiple states. As I mentioned before with the offender-based statistic, this chart shows the number of times that a released individual returns to prison. As you can see, almost 65% of released offenders in the year 2000 never return, and an additional 20% only return once. However, there is the small but non-negligible group who returns 2 or more times, and these individuals are the ones who end up driving recidivism statistics higher than they truly are. So before I conclude, I just want to talk about some of the things that we at APT, along with BJS, are trying to do to enhance the usability of the NCRP to estimate cross-state and within-state analyses. The graphic shown here is a heat map of the percent of offenders that we have a valid non-missing FBI number for the years 2013 and 2014. As you can see, we have FBI numbers with more than 80% non-missing for 34 states in those 2 years. Our plan is to match up FBI numbers of offenders across states in hopes of linking those releases in one state to readmissions in another to get a better estimate of the true recidivism. This graph shows 2 examples of states. The dotted line is looking at the within state only recidivism, and the solid line is when we add the cross-state matches. You'll notice that in the early time period, there's very little difference between the 2, and they tend to get more disparate as time goes along. This is a function of the quality of our linking algorithm being better in the later years, as more states have provided FBI number in 2012, 2013, 2014 than were available early on in the window. It's our hope that states will be able to backfill the data, and so that we will be able to get a better estimate for a longer time period. This next graphic shows a comparison of all 34 states, a 1-year recidivism rate with the cross-state links, as well as the cross-state and the Bureau of Prisons. APT Associates also has the contract with BJS for the Federal Justice Statistics Program, which collects all federal arresting agencies' data. So we're working with BJS about incorporating the Bureau of Prisons data into the NCRP in such a way so that we can link individuals who return into the federal system. This is the last slide I'll show, and it just shows that the enhancement used by linking individuals across states varied by state, as you would assume. States with the large population centers that are located near other states, such as New York City with large populations in Connecticut, New York, and Pennsylvania, could have a much more pronounced impact on state-level recidivism estimates if you're able to link across states than other states where that cohesion of populations does not exist. And that's all. Thank you very much.
List one more ground rule, and that is we're going to have the speakers speak in seriatim, one after the other, and then we'll get to the questions after that, because I have poor time management skills. So I think our next speaker is Duran Banks.
I'm Duran Banks. I work at RTI International, and we are under contract with BJS to conduct the Arrest-Related Deaths program. My colleague Paul Ruddle worked with me on this presentation. He's our data scientist and is responsible for a lot of the work that I'm going to present here today. Just quickly, I'm going to talk about what BJS's Arrest-Related Deaths program is. It's been in place since 2003, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the scope of it. Currently, we are redesigning the program to get better estimates of the number of arrest-related deaths in the United States, and I'm going to talk about that redesign, which includes two phases. The first one is what I'm going to speak most about today, and where we use media sources to identify potential arrest-related deaths. The second phase is where we then follow up on those potential deaths with law enforcement agencies and with medical examiners and coroners' offices to confirm whether those deaths did in fact occur in their jurisdiction and collect more information about those deaths. So the BJS started the arrest-related deaths program in 2003 following the passage of the Deaths in Custody Reporting Program, the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act. And it's following the spirit of the act. Is designed to collect information on a wide variety of deaths that occurred during an interaction or an arrest with law enforcement. So it can happen just prior to an arrest, during an arrest, or immediately following an arrest. We include several different manners here. The most prevalent type is a law enforcement homicide, where law enforcement use of force is the cause of the death or immediately precipitates the death. So these, by and large, include officer-involved shootings, but can also include use of tasers or other restraint tactics, or even if there is a vehicle pursuit, this is captured here. But there are other manners of death that we include in the arrest-related deaths program as well. They can be other homicides that happen during the course of an arrest, accidents, suicides, and also deaths due to natural causes, overdoses, et cetera. So when BJS started this program in 2003, it followed a voluntary reporting model. The data were collected from 2003 through 2014 using a centralized reporting coordinator in each of the 50 states of the United States. And this person was responsible for identifying all the deaths that had occurred in that state, for following the guidance that BJS had put forward to comply with the scope that I just mentioned. And they had some flexibility in how they were identifying the deaths. Some folks used FBI reporting systems. There's also the National Violent Death Reporting System in the United States that some state reporting coordinators had access to. Some used media reports. There was a wide variety of methods that they used. So there was some concern about that variability in methodology. So a couple of years ago, BJS decided to assess how well the program was capturing the number of deaths that there were in the US. And we assessed data from 2003 through 2011. And you can see here, we just looked at the law enforcement homicides. Those were the most prevalent types of deaths, and also the one we felt we had the highest confidence that we were capturing well. And so you can see we were around a little under 400, around 400 for most of the years, but in the most recent year we studied, the number of deaths went up. And so that was a concern, that why we were suddenly capturing more deaths in more recent years. As I said earlier, other concerns were variations in methodology, whether the state reporting coordinators were following the definition and the scope we put forward, but also in particular that increase in 2011. Around this time, the Bureau of Justice Statistics had started to use internet searches instead of just the voluntary reporting from law enforcement agencies. And so overall, we found that during this study period, BJS was actually capturing maybe just about half of the estimated number of deaths in the United States. Looking ahead to 2011, though, we were capturing about 70% of them. So the question was, what were we doing in the more recent years that we can perhaps apply to better capture the prevalence of arrest-related deaths in the United States? And so that led us to where we are today with the ARD program redesign. As I said before, there's two phases to this. The first one, we review news alerts and other public sources to capture an arrest-related death. We're tracking the efficiency of these various approaches to see which are best at helping us to identify deaths, and compiling lists of decedents. This will be followed up by an agency survey, which, as Jim said earlier, is more of the traditional model of collecting this information. We contact law enforcement agencies and medical examiner and coroner's offices to get that. So this is a graphic that describes our phase one approach. Following up on the upper left-hand side, we have what we call an event listener that uses key search terms to scrape the internet, call those media sources to get information about potential deaths. We do some text processing there to kick out some irrelevant or duplicate articles. And then we analyze the text of the sources themselves to further narrow down the information that we're going to review to identify these deaths. So going back to the event listener up at the top, these are some of the primary search terms that we use, and they are combinations of various spellings or permutations of those terms, and found in close proximity to another search term that would indicate that the police were involved. So typically, we start out with about 400,000 alerts per month coming in following those search terms. Kicking out the near duplicate ones where a number of sources will pick up an AP newswire or the same source is repeated over and over, that takes us down quite a bit to 120,000. We also kick out what we consider to be irrelevant articles or untrusted sources. We actually get a lot of hits from Amazon.com about movies or stories or books that have similar subject areas to what we're trying to capture. So anything that's a commercial site, we kick out. We also do not scrape social media. We only capture news sources. And we also kick out, to the extent we can, anything that's outside of the United States. So we still have a ton of articles after all that analysis there. And this is just one example of the aftermath of the San Bernardino shooting, where there were more than 20,000 articles referencing the same event. And you can see a big spike when the event occurred, but then we continued to get alerts and hits about this event as time has gone on. So part of our problem is how can we narrow down the resources that we're using to review these articles and identify deaths here. So going back to this process that we use, this is what we call the relevancy classifier. And so what we use is a text vector analysis, similar to a factor analysis, that looks at the text terms and their proximity to each other and identifies clusters of articles that are capturing similar events. And so just a couple of examples here. The pink cluster that's over there on the left talked about the aftermath, again, of the San Bernardino shooting and the issues related to Apple and the FBI trying to get access to their iPhone data. This other one down here are also outside of our scope. These are things that happen outside of the US. And so, again, this graphic is really just designed to show how the analysis clusters various articles together, and then we use the cluster of those articles to determine what is relevant and update our algorithms to produce articles for review that are most relevant for our purposes. So that takes us down to about 27,000 articles a month, where we remove things that are referring to the same event. And again, it's looking at how text terms are in proximity to each other to see if they're really talking about the same event there. And once we do that, we have individual reviewers who manually look at the articles. And again, when we started out, it was about 27,000 articles a month that they were going through. And we look at the articles and look specifically for identifying information about the death, the name, the date of death, and the agency that's involved. We do not collect additional information about the circumstances of the event under the premise that that information may be more reliable getting it from the agency involved or the medical examiner or coroner's offices. And so this is our reviewing interface here, where on the left-hand side, the reviewers capture those key details. On the right-hand side is the text of the article itself for them to review. So doing that, we identify maybe 2,500 articles a month that mention a potential arrest-related death. So it's about a 5 to 10% hit rate, if you will, of articles that we review that have identified a death. But still, even with the event listeners, we're getting a lot of information about the same deaths here. So we're not getting 2,500 unique decedents, we're getting 2,500 articles about an arrest-related death that meets our scope. So this is just one example of a decedent where we got a few thousand articles about this individual and got information, again, looking at the cluster analysis, identified different events related to the date of death. For this particular death, there were a lot of protests surrounding it, and you can see some of that information there where we saw spikes in our event listener, and that culminated a little bit earlier this year when there was an announcement that no charges would be filed in this particular death. So going back here, one of the things I mentioned earlier is that we really want to look at front-end process and see if we're capturing the type of articles and getting the type of information we need. So this looks back at some of our key primary search terms, and you can see the middle column there describes how many articles, about what proportion of articles are identifying a potential arrest-related death. So we see that particular search term using deadly force, we're getting quite a bit. Additionally, with standoff, about 12% of articles are identifying an arrest-related death. But more importantly to us, too, and to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, is that we don't want to miss any deaths. We want to be as comprehensive as possible. So this last column describes how many or what percent of those searches are identifying a death that we were not able to find anywhere else in the many thousands of articles that we've reviewed. And so you can see standoff was one that was higher than others where we're not capturing those deaths anywhere else, as well as cardiac arrest. All right, and as I mentioned just now, there's about 24% of the unique decedents that we find that we can't find in any other article. So while we have a lot of resources invested in reviewing this information, we feel like it's worthwhile investment because we don't want to miss those 24% that wouldn't be able to be found anywhere else. You can see most of the decedents we've identified are referenced in 4 to 10 articles, or the larger proportion, but also 2% we're finding in more than 100. And as I said earlier, San Bernardino we found in more than 20,000 articles. And this gives you a sense of how many unique decedents we've found by month since we started this back in middle of 2015. So we're getting around 150 a month, which is quite a bit more than what we were getting with our 2011 data before we started the ARD program redesign. So every month we've exceeded that number, and in many months we've doubled it. And this gives you an indication of the number of arrest-related deaths that we've identified across the U.S. The darker colors here indicate states where there have been more deaths, and California is the most populous state, and so there's a reason for that being darker there. Also, I should mention that California and Texas and Maryland have mandatory reporting laws, so they have been more comprehensive historically in providing information. This is the rate of unique decedents that per million residents that we've identified to date. And again, the darker colors are indicating states where there is a higher rate of people who die in custody by the population of that state. So once we get this list of unique decedents, then we'd go back again to the traditional model of surveying law enforcement agencies. We identify the medical examiner or coroner's offices with concurrent jurisdiction to the law enforcement agencies, and we send them a survey that says we've identified these individuals in your jurisdiction that we believe meet our definition of an arrest-related death. And we ask them to confirm that whether they agree with our determination, whether it meets our date scope, and if it occurred in their jurisdiction. For all those that they do confirm, then we ask them to provide information about the incident. We also ask them to identify any deaths that we did not find from our media sources, and we've had a few of those there. And this is the interface that the agency used to log into our system. It provides general information about the program, about the redesign, and the data collection forms. And these are the incident forms I was mentioning a moment ago. For the law enforcement agencies, we asked them specifically about the incident, what caused them to have contact with the decedent in the first place, what the decedent did during the event, such as move in a threatening manner, did the decedent have a weapon or display a weapon, what charges were they, might have precipitated the involvement with law enforcement agency, if any. And then we ask about what the law enforcement agency did during the event. Were there shots fired? How many officers were involved? Was there other use of force involved there? For the medical examiner and coroners, we're asking them specifically about the cause and the manner of death, in addition to asking them about confirming the decedent characteristics, race, sex, and others. And then we ask about whether a weapon was involved, what type there, and how the injuries were sustained if a decedent died from injuries. We are right now, that's where we are with the program. We just finished the agency survey, so we're in the process of looking at how many deaths were identified by agencies that we did not capture with our event listener that I've been speaking primarily about today. And we're going to do an analysis to examine what are the characteristics of the agencies involved in the events and the incidents that may further help the Bureau of Justice Statistics to learn more about the circumstances surrounding these events. Here's my contact information and my co-author as well, and Michael Planty, who was our main point of contact at the Bureau of Justice Statistics.
Next up is Gary Lafree, and is going to talk to us about the use of big data to build open source data on terrorism.
Muy buenos días, señoras y señores. My name is Gary Lafree, as just pointed out. I direct a center called the START Center at the University of Maryland, which has been set up to, I lost the slide, there we go, which has been set up to develop a science-based approach to the human causes and consequences of terrorism. In the remarks earlier this morning that Graham Newman made, I was struck by the fact that many of us who've been doing cross-national criminology work for many years sort of thought by the time we got to this stage that we would have a lot more comprehensive data on things like homicide, for example, than we end up having. And what's kind of, I guess, the hubris of what I'm going to talk about briefly right now is that we're actually collecting data on every single country in the planet. So there are all sorts of disadvantages and weaknesses in the method I'm going to talk about, but also it is quite interesting because I don't think there are any other sources really of data out there where we actually get information on every single place on the planet to some extent. So that's the sort of structure I want to talk about. And I think probably, as the previous presentation showed, in fact, the utility of this method is probably specific to particular kinds of problems you might have, particularly areas of criminal justice that are very important for policy reasons, but you lack data. I have here, of course, many of you in the room, these will be well known to you, that the main sources we've had traditionally for criminal justice data have included official data, like in the old days Interpol or the World Health Organization or the Uniform Crime Reports in the United States. We've had victimization surveys, and we've had some form of self-report data. And when you come to something like terrorism, all of these sources are problematic. Even the United Nations has still not come up with a comprehensive definition of terrorism. There's even differences across bureaucracies within the same country. There's no systematic data collection on terrorism being done across the world. Victimization surveys are problematic for obvious reasons. A lot of times victims are killed. A lot of times people don't realize they've even been the victims of a particular attack. And self-report surveys have some obvious problems, which is depicted humorously in this next slide, which shows two barbarians and a professor of barbarian studies. So us middle-class professors, I think, have a very difficult time going out to hot zones and interviewing people about their political violence and terrorism. I mean, although there are some very fine studies that are doing exactly this, it's not the kind of thing that's going to produce certainly global statistics or give you inference on whether things are going up or going down in a very general context. So I think the technology that made this open source world much more feasible is relatively recent. It came in the late 1960s in particular with the advent of satellite technology and handheld cameras. So starting in the late 1960s, for the first time in human history, it was possible for an event to happen anywhere in the world and to be piped into living rooms anywhere else in the world. Obviously, it didn't happen overnight, but it started to raise that as a distinct possibility. And in fact, terrorists were actually very quick to pick up on this. On July 22nd, 1968, 3 armed members of the Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command hijacked an El Al commercial flight scheduled to fly from Rome to Tel Aviv. The hijackers diverted the El Al plane and its 48 occupants to Algeria, released a few passengers but held 5 Israelis and 7 crew members hostage, and made a number of demands. And this was televised around the world. And in a sense, this marked the beginning of these sorts of open source databases, of which ours, I think, is now the longest running and the most comprehensive. And we call it the Global Terrorism Database. Now, I'm sure in the questions and answer period, we'll get to talk a little bit about validity in these areas. One of the things that I think is on our side with something like terrorism is, to some large extent, terrorism is political theater. So people are often trying to get into the media So unlike many ordinary criminals, which are seeking to remain anonymous, terrorists are often actually the opposite. They're often seeking publicity, and in some cases would regard their efforts as not successful unless they get that publicity. So we started out with a database that was originally collected by the Pinkerton Global Intelligence Service, the old Pinkerton, the Scottish detective agency that used to run stagecoaches in the American West. And they used to hire essentially ex-Air Force or military intelligence officers who would quit working for government and then go to work for this private company predicting how serious terrorism problems were. This is what the database looked like at that point in time. When I inherited this project about 12 years ago, it was data from 1970 to 1997. It was on handwritten or typed note cards stored in shoe boxes, basically. And the data in those days were taken mostly from wire services, especially from Reuters. They also relied heavily on papers that purported to be world papers like the New York Times and the London Financial Times. And it was fairly straightforward. They would they would digitize it at some points in time. One of the most recent digitizing efforts was on a TRX-80 computer, which we couldn't even find in the Smithsonian, actually. But it was a pretty primitive operation. Here's what we are moving for today. We essentially now, the data collection begins with a universe of about 1.6 million articles published daily, worldwide. About 600 million articles per year this amounts to. And interestingly, the size of this fire hose, I've got a slide here, I believe, is continuing to increase. This just shows the size of the fire hose we're dealing with from January 2013 to March 2016. Even during this period, the events have gone up from about 40 million to something like 60 million per year. The hose just keeps getting larger and larger. To convert this huge pipeline of information into a global terrorism database requires essentially 3 steps. The first step is we use Boolean filters that identify attack-specific keywords that help us to decide which articles to include and which to exclude. And it was interesting, Duran's earlier presentation, it sounds like you're using very similar sorts of methods for a much different problem. Over time, we've developed a set of filters that past experience has shown are especially likely to generate actual terrorist attacks. I brought a screenshot of some of these. The 3 best right now for us are the words attack, bomb, and blast. And so lots of these are sort of commonsensical. Some of them are not, though. For example, it turns out that terror is not a very good term for finding terrorist attacks, because too often it picks, a sports team, like a football team that's terrorizing another football team, or a particular group that's terrorizing another group. So over time, we use our human coders to fine-tune these to get them better and better. So it essentially works like programs like Google or Netflix, so that there's a continual iterative process to try to improve the quality of the keywords. And the second part of the process is we use natural language processing to deal with duplicates. And again, I'm struck by the previous presentation, where this is also a problem. Duplicates are a huge problem in the open source world. You can see the chart I have here, which looks like very much the one you just saw before from San Bernardino. Turns out this is actually from the Boston Marathon case, and you see the big spike there in our news coverage is basically picking up the Boston Marathon. So we had something like 25,000 news stories from the Boston Marathon attacks from the United States, and obviously we don't have the person power to go through all those to see which are duplicates. So we have to come up with a deduplication algorithm to get rid of those duplicates. And that sort of has changed over time for reasons that I don't really know. Right now, the sweet spot is 82.5%, and I can't explain why. Arithmetically, that's the case, but we find that that's the sweet spot for sort of balancing off how many cases we can get rid of versus how much error our coders have to pick up. So we also have with this, though, the problem of what happens if these, and this you didn't bring up in your earlier presentation, but what happens if the sources don't agree? What happens if you have differences? So we've had to develop a system that treats, the New York Times as more important than the Des Moines Register, for example. So we have, of the thousands of sources we use, we have this problem of trying to decide which ones to believe. And then the third step is machine learning models, which we use to classify the remaining articles as most likely relevant or not relevant. And this we also use techniques that are becoming pretty familiar in the Google search engine world. Based on these processes, we reduce the stream of data to about 50,000 articles per week, which is small enough that we can then process them with a staff of about 25 researchers. Only about 7% of these cases will eventually be included in the database. So right now we're collecting a rectangular data file with about 120 variables. And of course, one of the first things that I sort of skated over in my introduction is I mentioned that there is no universally accepted definition of terrorism. So we've had to come up with an operational definition. And ours is essentially, we start with 3 parts. We require that the incident must be intentional, the result of a conscious calculation, must entail some level of violence or threat of violence. And this, I mean, we can talk if we have time in the questions and answers. This actually becomes quite a complicated issue to sort out. And then the incident must be carried out by subnational perpetrators. So we're not picking up state-supported violence. In addition, we have 3 other criteria, and to give the researchers that use our data some flexibility, we include events if they meet any 2 of these 3 criteria. So you can sort of take a more sort of conservative approach or a less conservative approach depending on your analysis interests. The 3 additional criteria is that the act is aimed at attaining a political, economic, religious, or social goal. It's evidence of intention to coerce, intimidate, or convey some other message to a larger audience. And the violent act was outside the precepts of international humanitarian law insofar as it targeted non-combatants. So, of course, with an enterprise of this nature, you're quite interested in validity. The GTD only includes attacks that are documented by at least one, quote, high validity source. So attacks that are only reported by low validity sources, which the past 12 years we've developed a list that continues to evolve, are excluded from the database. And in fact, we're finding over time that the number of people, our staffers refer to this as purgatory, that if the database is from a low validity source, it goes to purgatory. And the number of cases in our so-called purgatory have been growing over time. So for 2014, we had 607 attacks in Iraq in this situation, 437 from Afghanistan, and 376 from Syria. And this tends to be the case. It's especially difficult to collect data on violence in war-torn areas, as all 3 of these countries illustrate. This seems to be the case also in some of the in some areas that are not currently in war, even in Pakistan, for example. One other observation about the GTD, it's unique. I mentioned that there were initially probably 10 or 12 of these sorts of open source terrorism data collection efforts, mostly in the UK and in the United States. One thing that's quite different about ours is it's domain specific. Many of the other open source databases have been based on area specialists. So there'll be a specialist from, say, Southeast Asia, specialist perhaps from Russia. Instead, we are organized according to domains. So we have a team that concentrates on location of the incident. As I'll show you in just a moment, we're able to geocode these incidents. We have a group that concentrates on perpetrators, a group that looks at targets, at casualties and consequences, weapons and tactics, and then general information, summaries and related attacks. This, again, is something that's only possible with evolving technology because we use databases that are now able to translate into English about 72 different languages. So back in the old days, you'd have to have someone who was an expert in Spanish, someone who spoke Russian. I mean, ultimately, you couldn't cover the entire field. Now we are able to do, I think, a better job of doing that, and we find we get higher fidelity by having people concentrate on a particular domain as opposed to a particular region of the world. So I want to move to a conclusion by just giving you some recent data that are produced by these methodologies. This is what our rectangular file looks like. It's very simple, basically. Many of you in the room will be using something familiar. So we've got cases on one axis and 120 variables across the other axis. This is what our database suggests in terms of worldwide terrorism going back to 1970 to 2014. The red line on the top maps total attacks, the dashed line fatal attacks, and the small dotted line attacks that take more than 10 lives. Just as I was preparing for these meetings, we are almost ready to release 2015 data, and we're finding about a 15 or 20% drop in worldwide terrorism in 2015 for the first time, as you can see here, since about 2004, which is kind of interesting because, which actually makes me feel a little better in the sense that I also showed you a moment ago, the fire hose that this is based on keeps growing, growing, and growing. And so interesting to see that despite that growing fire hose strength, we're actually picking up declines in worldwide terrorism. As I mentioned, we can geo-map these, georeference these cases. I brought an example from 2014. The red line, the darker the color, gives you areas of concentration. So you can see a kind of belt in sub-Saharan Africa. You can pick out certainly Bangladesh and areas in the Middle East. You see relatively little activity right now in North America and a little bit in the very top of South America. And then you see the Philippines and some of the areas in South Asia showing up. One of the interesting features of being able to geo-map these attacks over time is how much terrorism moves around. Most of the action in the 1970s was in Western Europe and North America. In the 1980s, most of the action moved to Latin America. You had groups like Sendero Luminoso, the FARC, the FMLN. Then there's a kind of a slow period, which you saw in the graph, where actually worldwide terrorism was at the lowest it's been in the last 50 years, and then a big increase most recently in the Middle East and South Asia. And we can look at these sorts of things with these kind of data. This shows for 2014-15 the 5 most active groups. We have the Taliban #1, ISIL #2, Boko Haram #3, the Maoist Communist Party of India, Maoist 4, and the Kurdistan Workers' Party, the PKK, comes in #5. In fact, in the 2015 data, the country that had the largest growth in worldwide terrorism in the database was actually Turkey, and in large part because of the increasing activities of the PKK. We can also use it to look at tactics. This shows that a very large proportion of the about 15,000 terrorist attacks a year come from bombings and explosions. Next most common are firearms or armed assaults, assassinations about 8%, hostage taking about 9%, and facility or infrastructure attacks about 8%. We can, of course, look at countries with the most problems in terms of terrorism. In 2015, the rank order was Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, Nigeria, Egypt, Philippines, Bangladesh, Libya, Syria, in that order. For the last probably 10 years, we've had especially heavy hitters have been Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India. Nigeria has been going up in the rankings recently. Starting in 2012, the U.S. State Department began using these data for its annual report to Congress on terrorism. They just released the most recent report about a week ago. I was interested in Graham's comments earlier about trying to get some sort of collection agent for global statistics on crime and criminal justice. And we've done this in a very, very limited way on terrorism. But our GTD portal now gets 219 million page views a year. The full data set has actually been downloaded over 250,000 times by people all around the world. And the website traffic includes 1,500 educational institutions, lots of nonprofits, and of course, lots of government agencies. So just to conclude, obviously this is not a perfect strategy. If you were able to get good international police data on terrorism, you would certainly think about it, although there are reasons to think that might be suspect as well. But it provides information in an area where we really had very little information. It allows data collection on a topic that cannot easily be studied, I think, in any other way. It also, which should be of great interest, I think, to the group here, it doesn't just cover, Western Europe and the United States and highly industrialized democracies. It includes estimates for the entire world, which is pretty rare when it comes to criminal justice statistics. It also provides data in close to real time. We can actually provide estimates up to 2 or 3 months after events happen. And as you know, one of the frustrations in our business is many of the databases that track criminal justice statistics run a year, 2 years, 3 years behind real time. And it's fairly cost effective. We're doing this from offices in Maryland for the entire planet with a team of about 25, including a lot of student interns and volunteers. So it's not inexpensive, but it's much cheaper, certainly, than any alternative I can think of. On the other hand, there are, of course, major weaknesses. Biases in media reporting. I think it's becoming the case. I have increasing confidence that it's pretty hard for a hijacking to go unnoticed. It's pretty hard for an assassination to go unnoticed. When people are killed, I think it's getting harder and harder to keep the world's media out, even in places with pretty authoritarian regimes. But nonetheless, you have this issue of bias in media reporting. You also have missing data and limited information on the less serious cases. I feel confident that we do much better at getting the big events than the small events. If there's an event that particularly doesn't take human life, if it's just aimed at property damage, it's much less likely still to escape, or much more likely to escape world attention. There can be selective blackouts. We have very few cases in our database from North Korea. So we ask ourselves, is that because the North Korean regime is just so effective at quashing terrorism, or is it because the media has been effectively kept out of North Korea? And then also, all of this is essentially on the perpetrator side. We've got little information on government responses. There's really no database like this that tracks what governments are doing, how they're responding, what measures they're taking, and so on, which is a big gap, I think, in our understanding in this area. And I just want to conclude by saying I listed some of the possibilities. We just heard one possibility, which is looking at arrest-related deaths, which it's difficult to get information. I'm working on a project where we're trying to use this methodology to look at school shootings. There is a project in the United States where the researchers have been able to successfully duplicate a piece of the Uniform Crime Reports using open source data and actually crowdsourcing it with students. You can think about some utility here for cybercrime, white-collar crime, hate crime, corruption, illicit financial flows, perhaps human trafficking. And I wouldn't say it's going to solve data problems in any of those areas, but it does provide another source and eventually, I think, provides us some ability to compare sources and do a much better job of validity checking. So I'll leave with contact information. Be happy to, our website's actually quite extensive. In fact, these data you can download this afternoon. They're all open source, they're all unclassified. And be happy to take questions either here or if we're able to, if you forget the question, be happy to take it when I get back to Maryland. Thank you very much.
Back here, so you're not going to escape questions, that's for sure. Whether we can get to them all is another matter. So we've got a bunch of questions for folks. I think that one question directed towards Chris, I'll sort of do them, so even distribution here. I think that one question pertained to your use of recommitment as a measure of recidivism, and the questioner wondered whether or not you had used alternative definitions of that, such as arrest or court processing and so on.
That's a great question. Unfortunately, we can't. One of the big limitations of the NCRP data set is that we only get prison admissions and releases, so the information on arrests or offense at arrests is unavailable in the data set. And so to look at recidivism, we are limited to reincarceration.
But the criminal history data has alternatives in it. They'll have arrest data as well.
I believe so,
Okay.
yeah.
So, Gary, I got this raft of questions, and so I just got them at the last minute here. So I'm going to do this on the fly, not well, obviously. One question was whether or not you think that something, I don't know how you can judge this, but whether or not you think a system like the START system could be done for statistics on Mexico, for example. So this questioner says, you know, a lot of it, the media's structure is different. You know, they use blogs as opposed to other things. And so if you want to take a flyer at that.
Well, I think probably it would very much depend on what you're doing. So in a sense, the way our stuff works follows the source we're using. So if you think about the classic newspaper, it's the who, what, where, when, why. It's essentially what we picked up. We're sort of even divide the responses that way. So if you can make a reasonable argument that the case is high profile enough to get into the media and be reliably reported, and that's what journalists do. They tend to give you that sort of information. So we've been doing this lately. We've been working with school shootings. And in the United States, school shootings get a lot of publicity. I think we can relatively well cover school shootings. Perhaps in the case that Duran's talking about with deaths related to arrests, which tend to get a lot of publicity. So you'd have to ask that question specific to Mexico. So what are the areas that are reported that are very difficult to sort of not report on, I suppose. You know, I don't think this is going to be effective for studying theft or studying burglaries, and I don't know the Mexican situation well enough to know, but I would guess, for example, homicides are probably going to get into the press pretty reliably, at least if you look at, you know, a large distribution and you include small news outlets and so on. So you have to ask yourself that question, and this won't work otherwise. In terms of the blogs issue, though, we're doing some work right now. I mean, there's no reason you can't expand this into other fields. I mean, the same technology could look at blogs. We have a project that's looking at Twitter. I mean, you could use the same sort of methodology in other areas. Again, you'd have to ask that question, though. What can you validly expect is likely? We've gone in with the idea that because terrorism is often theater and people are trying to publicize it, it's a perhaps better argument for that. But we still have quite a number of cases, and as I left the hotel this morning, when I left at least, the bombing in Istanbul, no one had claimed responsibility yet. And there are a fair number of cases where no one claims responsibility, so even with terrorism, the argument is not foolproof.
One question here is, the questioner asked, do authorities accept BJS data collections based on media? And how do your stats compare with the official, that is to say, voluntary system estimates?
Is this on? We don't accept the media cases as the reliable estimates, and that's a key component of the collection, is that we then go and confirm them with law enforcement agencies and medical examiners and coroners' offices. So to answer the question you put forth earlier, Gary, we don't take one media account over another. We take them both and then go to the law enforcement agency. So the question then becomes, what if the law enforcement agency says this death did not meet the definition, but it appears that the media account did? And the premise of our redesign is to really use those official sources to be the voice of the prevalence. We have not compared directly with official sources from the FBI's supplementary homicide reports, except when we did our coverage assessment of the 2003 to 2011 data. And so we compared ourselves to the FBI then and found that the ARD program had slightly better coverage than the FBI, and certainly in those more recent years of 2011 had the difference between the ARD program coverage and the FBI's coverage was greater.
One question had that your release cohort estimates of recidivism are much higher than your offender-based estimates or entry cohort-based estimates. Which one's better?
That is true that the estimates are very different. So the offender-based is traditionally a lot lower than the event-based. What's better is, I believe, is dependent upon your view of what you're trying to study. If you are trying to look at recidivism of all offenders, where each offender is a unique person, then I would trust the offender-based. But if you're interested in doing policy designed at reducing the total number of recidivism events, then I think the release cohorts are more than sufficient for that.
Is there a way to track down data ranging from the time a crime is committed until the perpetrator is sentenced? And what kind of database would you need?
And I'm taking that. Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, in theory, yes. I mean, I would apply the same reasoning as before. It has to be the kind of case that you think is going to get into the media. The closest thing we have to that, I think, are hostage situations where they often go on for days, and so there is a sort of longitudinal element to that. Or even with coordinated attacks, such as has been happening in Paris and 9/11 and others, where there's a period of time between the sort of beginning and the end. So in principle, yes, you could do that, but again, it has to be newsworthy enough, and you have to have news agencies that are responsible enough in their reporting that you can legitimately argue it's showing up, basically.
It's, I think, are there any plans to expand? I don't know if you can answer this or this is a BJS question. I think that I saw Alan Beck creep into the audience there a bit back. He might, but I think that any plans to expand ARD to non-fatal serious injuries?
I'll attempt to answer that. Not right now. The ARD program was designed to be responsive to the Deaths in Custody Reporting Act passed in the United States, and that was reauthorized in 2014. So it's focused specifically on deaths.
Have you broken out your results by type of release? For example, parole, people on parole generally are considered more at risk of recidivism simply because somebody's eyeballing them. So in that sense, have you broken that out by status?
That is a good question. We have internally that we have nothing ready yet for public consumption. We're working with BJS towards a publication on recidivism that should be out hopefully in the next few months. I'm not sure if that'll be part of it, but with the data, it's publicly available. You just have to request it from BJS, and that's one of the questions that someone could look into. That would be very interesting.
Generate a city-level version of your database.
Absolutely. We've done some work, and there's a publication out. It came out with Rutledge just last year that does quite a bit of that. We can go down to, I mean, now we get longitude and latitude of the event. Again, though, within the confines of what happens within the newspaper reporting. Obviously, if it's not in the media, we don't know about it. But we record as much detail as is available. So in some areas, we even have, we have addresses, we have 2 cross streets, but we very frequently have cities.
Durin, do you have a demographic profile of the deceased? For instance, race, ethnicity, religion, any of the other attributes that may have...
We don't collect that from the media sources. We collect it from the agency survey, so we rely on the medical examiners and coroners and law enforcement agencies to give us that information. We do not collect information on the religious affiliation, only race, sex, age.
This one I'm not sure you're going to be able to answer, Chris. I think it's someone noted that very often people in the administrative record data on corrections collect the address or the last known address of an inmate, and so there are pros and cons to this in terms of. So, do you have that in your database, and do you use it?
So that is a new addition for this current year. Previously, we did not collect that. We had the county in which an individual was sentenced, and that was as specific geographic data as we had. In the 2015 data collection, we started collecting the last known address for our prison admissions as well as our post-confinement community supervision admissions. So currently that is not available, but the hope is that it'll be available in our next annual archive, and it'll continue to grow as we collect more years of data.
I think to some extent they were also questioning about the wisdom of including that kind of thing.
Obviously, that's something that you would want to be cautious with, as I'm sure a lot of it will depend upon which state is reporting it. As with most of the variables that we collect, the quality of the data depends tremendously upon the quality of the systems that they come from. So I'm sure for certain states that the data will be very accurate and will be ready for use, whereas others, users should be more cautious. With only a single year, it'll be difficult to know truly which states are the better ones and which ones aren't, but hopefully over time, patterns will develop and it'll be easier to assess which states have more believable data.
Gary, a lot of folks, several folks are sort of interested in your ability to distinguish between intentional homicides and conflict-related deaths among the victims of terrorism attacks.
Yeah, great question. We have, in fact, it's been an interesting process because we have this thing we call data camp, and so about every 6 months the whole staff gets together to discuss, what goes in and what doesn't. And if I look at the sort of DNA of that process over time, and by the way, this is online. If you're interested, you can actually. We have about 110 pages now in this coding manual. It does get complicated to do that. It definitely does. And I think the most complicated are in war-torn areas, where it gets very difficult to separate terrorism from ethnic cleansing, from insurrection, from ordinary crime, from organized crime, etc. All I can say is we've developed rules that come as close as we can come at this point in time to doing that. But it's difficult. But then, you can ask yourself, how difficult is it to distinguish homicides in general, or rape in general, or assault in general? I mean, we've picked a very difficult field as a group. So I'm not sure terrorism is in some ways any more difficult than more ordinary kinds of crimes in that regard.
This is a question that's addressed, I guess, to both Duran and to Gary, because there's a certain similarity. I mean, you guys have introduced a methodology that most of us who are trained traditionally aren't familiar with. So when you think about a data collection, you think about a sample, you think about an instrument, and so on. And you have various ways of telling whether or not you did a good job in that sense. So, I mean, there are two questions. One is, so there are major design decisions in a survey or a data collection that we're traditionally used to doing. In the kind of open source data collection, what are the counterpart design decisions that someone must make? And then the second one, and this may take too long, I think, but how do you know what you have is good? How do you know it's fit for use?
I'll start. So the design decisions we made are search terms and what approach we're going to use to crawl the internet. We looked at a variety of providers and went with one that I had not heard of before at the time, but that was crawling the most sources, and they continue to upgrade which sources they crawl. So there's a decision about which vendor you use to give you the information, the comprehensiveness of the text that you get back, so that we can analyze those as well. And as I said, looking at those search terms initially. For the second part of that, we ask law enforcement agencies and medical examiner coroners' offices if we've missed any, and then we go back and update our search terms again based on the characteristics of the deaths that they say that we have missed. We also survey a sample of law enforcement agencies that did not show up in our list to, again, ask if there's some there. Because, again, there's concerns about media coverage and if there may be parts of the United States or certain types of arrest-related deaths that are less likely to be included in the media. And again, based on what those agencies tell us about deaths we may have missed, we then go back to the beginning and update our approach.
Do you compare the estimates at each stage?
The estimates of the
In
number?
other words, you change a search term, do you look at the effects on the estimates?
Yes, and we also look at kind of the error rate. When we do these classifiers, we look specifically at, when we reduce this volume, are we potentially missing some deaths? But this is all complicated, again, by the fact that our provider continually updates how they crawl the internet. So there's a lot of error that's introduced in that as well to make it difficult to compare over time.
And so, yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the main things we've done to improve the quality is by making everything public So we've really encouraged, like, there's a paper that's about to come out, for example, where people had police data from a part of India. And so they were able to look at what the police were calling terrorism and compare it to our database. There's another project that's doing something similar in Turkey. And so I think the more of those sorts of projects where, not that, you know, what's really kind of interesting about that is that you probably don't also in terrorism regard the police as exactly the gold standard either, but you can at least see how those different measures stack up. So I think having it go public is quite interesting and quite important. And we also in the database have added a whole series of flags when essentially when coders think that that there's enough evidence to support putting the case in, but they're concerned that it looks like something else, like it looks like organized crime, or it may look like ethnic cleansing or insurrection. So we have flags in there, and so analysts, or policymakers for that matter, can strip out cases that were on the bubble. When we deliver the data to the US State Department, for example, they strip out all of the flags where there's any doubt, and have a kind of lower rate based on that. So, but you can see from that example, you know, the potential error goes in both directions. You know, you have both type 1 and type 2 error. So, you know, I think what we try to do is strike a balance between those and give the researcher some control over how conservative they want to be in their approach.
Cutler, there's a question here on what happens when data is not comparable across the states. Do you discard it, and how much missing data do you have on the crucial variables?
So we don't discard any data. We have a couple different files that we archive every year. One is our term file, which I described, and we have a secondary data set that we internally refer to as the orphan widow file. So every state of data or year of data that we don't end up including in our term file is archived as part of the orphan widow, so that an analyst can request that, and then if they choose to keep that data in, they can make that decision. As far as the data being comparable across states, we look for the data to be comparable within state and across years. So we look to make sure that there's not a high incidence of ambiguous or problematic sequences in a certain year or certain years before we determine that that data is of high enough quality to put in the term. The data disagrees across state quite tremendously. We have, I think, 7 states that are called unified states, where they submit both prison and jail data, and their system collects that. So naturally, any statistics generated from those states are going to be different from some of the other states that don't include jail data, as far as time served goes and things like that. Other states have a cutoff of 2 years or more for a sentence in order to be considered part of their jail. So we don't, when putting together our term file, we don't discount data because it doesn't align with data reported by other states, but as long as it's internally consistent within that state over the time period.
Durin, this is, well, I was going to say this comes from somebody who doesn't know about the curse of federalism, but this is, I suspect this is someone from Germany, so they may know the curse of federalism. But the question is, why is it not possible to require all police agencies to directly report every arrest-related death?
I believe that's a question for another government entity other than myself. It's not currently possible.
I could try an attempt at this, having been in the government previously. I think there are 18,000 police departments in the United States. Those police departments, most of them report to the local official, which is a mayor. You would have to get a law passed and enforced, probably at the state, and that would take quite a bit of, there's 50 states, so it would take a little bit of doing to get that done. There are many data collections that, you know, you just can't get that kind of support where Congress or anybody else is willing to go out or even has the jurisdiction to tell what those local officials what to do. the Uniform Crime Reports, which is a voluntary system. They have state mandatory reporting laws, but no police chief, in my mind, has ever been put in jail for not reporting to the UCR. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's extreme federalism, and which makes it much more difficult to get compliance by fiat in these kind of data collections. I think it's I don't know if that answers your question or not, but that's probably the best we can do. There's a question here, Gary, for you. It says, have you been able to detect any pattern for the attacks? Where do they happen? Who commits the attack? At what time of day do they happen?
Yes.
Can you describe a little of those?
We actually, I think I mentioned that we have a book with Rutledge that goes into quite a bit of detail on the whole database with items like that. Yes. I mean, terrorism, like every other type of crime, is highly patterned. It's highly concentrated at every level. You could see the map I showed. You could see the concentration at the world level. But it's the same with every other place. You look at within countries, within cities even. Like in the United States, there's a huge number of attacks in New York, but virtually every one of them is in Manhattan, not the other boroughs, for example. So like other kinds of crime, terrorism is highly situationally specific. I don't know if Graham's still in the room, but he's quite right about that. And actually, also, I suppose, if you're going to look for generalities, it's also quite low tech. Very few chemical, biological, radiological. We do not have a single nuclear attack in the data, fortunately. We have no cyber attacks. I always get a question about cyber terrorism. We have no cyber terrorism. And the only known cases so far we think were instigated by governments. I assume there will be one eventually, but so most of them are prosaic. They're bombs. They're material that's relatively easy to get your hands on. Lots of firearms. Bombs and firearms are probably 80% of the total. The kind of, in fact, you know, I think one of the important things about these databases from a public policy standpoint is just to show how unusual the high-profile attacks like Madrid, like London, like recently Paris and Brussels, they really are quite unusual cases. They're not the run-of-the-mill attack at all.
Gary, this is another one for you, I think. We often say that BJS data is freely accessible and you need only good software to get the data. It seems that a lot of work is still needed. How much workforce is needed to run the programs? I think it's referring to both of your programs. In other words, I think you mentioned something about the size of the number of minions you have, but I think this question is about the amount of manual coding that goes into these. Once you've filtered, you still have so how big a job?
So to collect our global terrorism database it uses about 25 people right now, some of whom are interns and students, and it costs us about $1.5 million a year to collect, basically.
We have 12 coders that do it not as their full-time job, but they spend 10 to 20 hours a week doing this, and we have regular trainings of them as well. We also have 3 data scientists who work on this fairly heavily to examine what the coders are seeing and, again, update their algorithms. They help us also to not only deduplicate the articles, but deduplicate the decedents and have that process. And I think we spend perhaps $50,000 a month doing this. And again, like the machine learning will take more of the resources over time, and the idea is to reduce the amount of manual coding that is done.
I think that, have either of you considered machine learning and to reduce this, or is it not of the volume that would be required?
So we do use machine learning techniques, but I feel pretty strongly that at this point in technology, you still get better accuracy by having humans at the end of the process. We've been approached by companies like IBM that claim they can. Well, and there are fully automated systems now that do this, but I think their fidelity is much worse right now. It does continue to evolve. I think The machine learning processes have gotten much better since we've been involved, in fact. But I think still it's the case that the situation is complex enough, at least if you're looking for 120 separate variables. You may be able to get some very basic information, but getting that kind of detail, I think still cannot be done successfully entirely by machine.
Well, it's also the volume. By the time you filtered it down, the volume isn't really there to make it that worthwhile in some ways. So, again, I think this goes to Gary and then one to Chris. How do you define high validity and low validity sources? What criteria do you use to classify sources?
That's a great question because you can't sort of take that off the shelf. We started out by using, with newspapers at least, we use circulation figures. That's not 100% great, though, of course, because you get some very sort of lower quality. We've pretty much now taken, we don't try to decide whether the New York Financial Times is better than the Wall Street Journal. We now have much broader categories. So all of the sort of, I guess, fairly reputable international press sources would be in one category. And we only use a small number of those categories for exactly the reason that's probably being suggested here. Doing a complete numerical ordering is I don't know exactly how you would do that, frankly.
I have a question actually for both of you again because of your shared efforts. I think that what do you do with change estimates? It seems like you have a constantly evolving methodology where search terms change, where databases change, and maybe even coding schemes change. And so how do you do a change estimate with that?
So one of the things we've been doing that actually Laura Dugan, my colleague, and I have been working on this is we are starting to put in at least dummy variables for the 4 main periods of data collection. And those, to my surprise, have actually been pretty effective in terms of, I mean, they do make a difference in terms of calculation. Beyond that, though, this whole business with the fire hose is a tough problem, actually, because a lot of people that are in this area are, like Gary King at Harvard has been talking a lot about this. It's a big problem because, as you could see from the tables I brought in, we're getting more and more global information. Well, I shouldn't say it's a big problem. I think we don't know how big of a problem it is. It's an unknown. So we've been working on other sorts of strategies for adding sort of what the NCVS did in the past, of trying to come up with an adjustment, but we have not succeeded, frankly.
So you would create point estimates.
Correct.
You would model them. You'd create, your point estimate would not be a data-based estimate, but a model-based estimate.
Correct.
Partly data-based, but partly model-based as well.
Yes.
Okay. Darren, do you?
So the capture-recapture analysis we did to assess the coverage of the ARD program previously compared the ARD program data to the FBI data. And we got different coverage estimates over time. Again, as the ARD program methodology changed, we hypothesized that that was part of it. But I echo what Gary said, it's a huge problem. We're very concerned about how media covered these types of articles. Certainly in the United States, it's covered extensively right now, arrest-related deaths, and that may not have always been the case. Also, with the proliferation of more new media sources, we're also getting more information there. So our approach is really, again, to try to combine what we're getting from the media with an external official source to confirm the information as much as possible. And then we may go back and do another assessment of the coverage to get better over time estimates. But it's a huge problem.
And you would go back and adjust your estimates as a change estimate?
We haven't considered that yet, but it's a possibility.
Okay. And Chris, I think you get the last question, I think, and which is, what factors have you identified that explain the asymmetries in reporting capacity between corrections, between prisons, institutions, I guess states in that sense, and do you know whether BJS is doing anything to address these differences?
I think a lot of the differences can't really be addressed by BJS. States vary tremendously in size and resources allocated to the Department of Corrections. You know, a state like California has a very large system. Through much of the early 2000s, they had over 100,000 admissions and releases per year. So a system like that is going to, require a lot more resources and than a state that only has a couple hundred admissions and releases. So as far as dealing with those differences across states, I don't know if there is much that can be done. However, we've worked with BJS and with the states to try to see what we can do to help increase the validity of their data. There are a lot of states that we communicate with multiple times throughout the year. As we investigate, we get sample cases that we send back to the states to let us know, in these cases, what's going on and how we can incorporate that information into our algorithms. So it's a continually evolving process in which we try to take what we observe and what the states are noticing and work with the states to enhance their abilities or to make our algorithms more accurate.
Well, thanks, Chris. I think that's all the questions. I hope I've grouped them correctly and everybody got their word in. I think I want to thank you all for your questions and for your involvement. And I want to thank the speakers for showing us a little bit of the brave new world. So thank you very much.